So our next session, Climate Change Disclosures, is one that addresses a topic that has become very important over the years. It's being led by Keir Gums, the Chief Legal Officer of Broadridge Financial Solutions. In his role, Keir oversees the legal, compliance, and physical security teams for Broadridge, helps lead Broadridge's policy efforts, and serves as the primary legal advisor for senior management and the board of directors. Prior to his time at Broadridge, Keir was a partner at Covington & Burling in D.C. and held positions within the SEC, including serving as a counsel to an SEC commissioner. Keir, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Tom. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to say something that I'm pretty sure literally every single other moderator is going to say, which is so nice to see people in person, for us all to be together again, talking about these issues in governance and securities that we all know and love. So just wonderful to see you all today. The other thing I'll say is there is an acronym, ESG, that I think you've heard at least twice today. We're going to continue that trend. I think you're going to hear a lot about it over the next few days. We're going to focus a little bit on a narrow piece of ESG, which is climate, just a tiny little part of ESG. And I've assembled a real all-star cast of presenters up here with me today. We've got a mix of public and private experience. We've got the investor experience. And so it's going to be really nice. And as I was looking at this list of co-panelists, I thought a little bit about Kevin Bacon. I'm sure you've all thought about the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. And for this moment, I feel like I'm Kevin Bacon. Every person on this stage, I've spent some portion of my career working with in one capacity or another. To my far left, I've got Alvin Hunspot, who's now at Uber. He has taken over the sustainability responsibilities there, someone I've known for a long time, including in his days back at McKesson, then to Change Healthcare, now at Uber. I will also note, I encouraged him to take the role at Uber, and I think he's doing a fantastic job. To Alvin's immediate right, we've got Karen Garnett, who's now the head of sustainability at Schwab. And my Kevin Bacon connection to Karen, she was one of my first bosses at the SEC when I started as a baby lawyer back in 1999. I'm very grateful you don't hold it against me anymore, Karen. To Karen's immediate right, we've got Melissa Duru. Melissa is a senior lawyer at Covington & Burling. She's had a number of roles at the SEC before she took the job at Covington & Burling. She's also someone who was a neighbor for a long time, also shares a Caribbean connection, and has a ton of expertise on climate, which we're going to call upon today. Then last but not least is Marion McIndoe, who I am a little embarrassed to admit in front of a crowd, probably my best hire ever. When I was at Uber, one of the things that we were trying to build was a new ESG program. We looked around, and Marion McIndoe, following, I believe it was a CII conference, 2018, I believe it was. She came up afterwards. She was like, "You guys need help on your ESG program." And she came in and she helped us build our ESG chops at Uber. Then she moved on to Parnassus, where we still maintain the Kevin Bacon connection. They're one of our largest investors. And so when I say we've got an all-star cast on climate, I truly mean it. I've learned almost everything I know around ESG and climate from the combination of folks here on the panel, and I'm really excited about what we have to talk with you about today. So there are a number of things that we're going to try to cover in the time that we've been allotted. Of course, you can't have a conversation about climate without talking about the SEC rulemaking proposal and the expected adoption, we think, sometime in the next few months, so we'll talk about that. But we're not going to just focus on U.S. climate-related influences on governance and disclosure. We're also going to talk about climate developments in Europe, particularly how the developments in Europe can impact all of you, whether you be an in-house lawyer or someone who advises companies. Then we'll move on to the alphabet soup, focusing on 2 particular acronyms, TCFD and CDP reporting. I'll just say for the record, we did our TCFD reporting for the first time this year at Broadridge. We learned a lot from it, and so I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel about how that can be done effectively. And then the next thing we'll talk about is trends in climate reporting, the ESG pushback that we're all hearing and seeing about, and of course, environmental justice. And last but not least, we'll get to the nuts of this panel, which is how do you actually do all of the things that we're talking about? How do you collect climate data for reporting purposes? How do you create disclosure controls around those processes, getting the information assured, and most importantly, telling the right story using that data? So really, really exciting lineup. And with that, I thought we'd jump right in. So Melissa, I was hoping that you can kick us off with talking a little bit about the SEC rulemaking and where we are right now.
Sure. Thank you very much, Keir. And to repeat what Keir said, so happy to be here and to see some of you in person for the first time. So, you know, I'm not sure how many were around for the prior two speakers, but here we are, and obviously everyone is waiting with bated breath with respect to the final climate-related disclosure rule out of the SEC. By all accounts, the only signal that we've received as of 3 weeks ago was the RegFlex agenda, which posits an April or spring 2023 timeline. As you all know, that RegFlex agenda is extremely aspirational, but as you also know and have seen, given the pace and the number of regulatory proposals and rulemaking activity coming out of the SEC, that Chairman Gensler has definitely been on track, generally speaking, with respect to getting some of these proposals and finalized rules out. So we can expect, one would imagine, that the spring 2023 is what we're going to be looking at as far as a final rule. Now, that said, I do think, just to take a step back, there are probably 3 major items that will affect both the timing and the content. So hearkening back to something that Tom had said previously on the last panel, I do anticipate that these 3 categories of items will actually change the overall content as well as the timing from the proposed rule to the final rule. And those 3 categories are: 1, the unprecedented number of comment letters that came in on the climate rule proposal. As you all know, there was something like over 4,000 comment letters that came in that were substantive and unique. And that's during both sets of comment periods, because as you recall, there was a reopening for what was due to technical glitches in the fall, and additional comment letters came in of a substantive nature even in that period. The SEC has to obviously demonstrate some level of deliberation and consideration of these comment letters for purposes, as you all know, related to the Administrative Procedure Act, and to show that they have duly considered the comments and feedback on the proposal. That's going to take some time. The second category of items that will obviously likely affect the timing and the content is the litigation challenges. You know, after the proposal came out, you had a landmark Supreme Court decision, West Virginia versus EPA, which raises major questions doctrine and challenges potentially to the SEC's statutory authority. All of this will likely mean that the staff will be very judicious and be very careful in framing a final rule that would likely be able to withstand some of the challenges that are anticipated there. And then the last item, and Keir touched upon this and we've heard reference to it in the other panels, is the international context. The SEC's climate rule proposal is not being done in a vacuum. There are international movements, regulatory movements, movements at national levels that are geared towards addressing climate change, geared towards gathering, through collaborations with the private sector and public sector, gathering the information that is necessary in order to address climate risk and financial risk. And as a result of that, you have regulatory regimes that are being stood up and adopted, as in the EU and the CSRD, which we'll touch upon, as well as an International Sustainability Standards Board baseline, global baseline for reporting on climate-related risks. And at the end of the day, the interoperability, the way in which the SEC's rule will interact with and match, so to speak, some of the rules, some of the requirements that are being stood up in other jurisdictions is probably somewhere in the SEC staff mind as well as they move towards finalizing a rule. So with that, I think we can move to the next slide. So, you know, when we're looking at likely items for consideration and content, I think it's important to note that the rule that was proposed aligns with the TCFD, and that is likely to be an item from a foundational standpoint that's going to stay. Don't see much movement there, just given, again, from an international context, you have EU regulations, UK regulations, regulations in Asia, frameworks that are all TCFD aligned. And the 4 foundational principles are governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. Disclosure items that fit within each of those are what you're likely to see retained. We can go to the next slide, please. And we see this in the proposed rule. We have on the screen the climate-related governance and risk management type qualitative disclosures. We have financial statement impacts and climate-related risks, which we'll get into a little bit later in terms of quantitative disclosures, transition plans, climate-related targets and goals, greenhouse gas emissions. All of these, again, to some varying degree, will fit within those TCFD foundational principles. And when we think about the climate rule proposal, it's good to kind of just, as a refresher, kind of go through the principal items that were proposed and to kind of discuss the ways in which we likely, as a result of those 3 categories, the comment letter feedback, the litigation challenges, and the international context, the areas that might be changed in the final rule. Of course, no one has a crystal ball, so this is all, conjecture at this point. But nonetheless, so the first category of items was, material, climate-related risks and opportunities, disclosure around those and how they affect a business's strategy and operations in the short term, long term, medium term. Then you have a significant amount of disclosure focus on oversight. We heard from the last panel, the who, what, when, where, how often, that the board and the management is contemplating their management of climate-related risks and opportunities. The expertise that's on the board, the level of which, through management's eyes, the level and the ability of management to accurately inform the board, and the strategy that is then born of that type of interaction between management and the board. Disclosure around that. Don't think that that's going to go away, just because, again, it is a critical component of the TCFD kind of framework, and it's one that, from a comment letter perspective and from feedback that was received, wasn't one that had the most kind of vehement opposition. Then the next item was metrics, and so here we delve into one of the principal items that you heard on the last panel has been the source of much deliberation and consternation, which is the financial statement impact metrics. This notion that, if you have a climate-related event that contributes more than a 1% threshold change in a line item in your financial statements, that you're going to have to provide in the notes to the audited financial statements disclosure pertaining to that, which brings in SX requirements, which brings in auditor review and internal control and reporting requirements and concerns, and at such a granular level. Significant pushback on that proposal, just as we heard, because of the lack of or impossibility at this stage by many to even find a workable solution or a workable infrastructure that is in place to address at that level of granularity and to capture at that level of granularity the disclosure that's being called for. So I would imagine that we will see some level of an adjustment to that based on the feedback. And then you have, of course, you have the big elephant in the room, which is the GHG emissions disclosures. So Scope 1 and Scope 2, everyone's going to be responsible for those, and then you have the attestation requirements that are associated with large accelerated filers and accelerated filers in a graduated, as proposed, in a graduated manner over time, and moving from limited to reasonable assurance. There has been some pushback on the timing associated with when those assurance requirements and attestations would need to be, implemented. Perhaps we will see some adjustments there. Who knows? But the biggest item, obviously, which everyone is focused on, is Scope 3. And so on scope 3, I think you kind of have two major camps in terms of the principal debate. You have one camp that says that scope 3 is absolutely critical in terms of truly being able to assess the progress that any entity is making towards its climate targets and goals, because it constitutes the lion's share of emissions that most companies are producing in terms of carbon footprint. But then you have the very kind of practical alternative argument to that, which is that, but we can't measure it. There are no standardized methodologies to measure it. As we speak right now, the GH protocol, which is the principal document and guiding principle for carbon accounting around scope 3, that itself is undergoing revision and is open for comment. So there is a significant amount of movement as far as being able to accurately measure scope 3. And when you add on to that liability associated with including that disclosure in a filed SEC document, again, it is likely to be an area that we will see some level of adjustment as far as that is concerned. And then we have transitions and targets, and the transitions and targets kind of disclosure requirements are really, I think, to address one of the principal investor protection concerns and just market transparency concerns that the SEC has noted and that others in the EU have noted around greenwashing, right? If you're going to say that you are moving towards a particular target, how are you getting there? What are the methodologies? How can one measure progress in a meaningful way and keep some level of accountability there? So those are, kind of big picture the items that we're focused on. But, and we'll have to wait to see how the SEC addresses some of these areas. And
I was going to say, can I jump
Yeah,
in
sure.
just with one observation and then maybe a question for the group? The observation is, I think that there has been a lot of criticism of the agency in the way that it's pursued some of its rulemaking, and I'm not taking a position on that, but I do think that the chair and the division leadership in CorpFin should get some credit for the approach that they've taken with respect to climate. And I say that from this perspective, which is, if you were to start from scratch, theoretically, they could have approached this climate issue with one of, we're going to create new standards, we're not going to try to take advantage of what's already been built with TCFD, CDP, GHG, there's lots of acronyms, and they chose to follow the approach from TCFD and the metric disclosures from the GHG emission standard. And I think that that's something that they should get credit for. When you look at what a lot of companies that are doing climate reporting have already done, many of them have already incorporated elements, maybe not all, but elements of TCFD into their reporting structures. And similarly with the greenhouse gas emission standard, they didn't start from scratch. It's something that a lot of companies are doing. So I think that they deserve a lot of credit for at least doing that. Second point, and this is a question for the group, Melissa, you highlighted a number of provisions that you're kind of watching to see what the SEC does in response to the comment letters. I want to ask the group about three of them. The first was the potential exclusion of scope 3, which, just speaking from Broadridge's perspective, more than 95% of our emissions are in scope 3. And so if we took that out, that would take out the lion's share of our emissions. So question one, can you still achieve their goals if they take that out? Second one is the financial statements, which I think very few companies have anything in place already to prepare that kind of information. When we have conversations with our CFO, there's a lot of consternation, so I'm curious what others are seeing. And then the third one is one where I've been a little surprised by some of the feedback, which is one of the requirements is around disclosure about whether you have a director that has experience with respect to emissions and climate-related reporting, and there was a lot of pushback from that in the comment letters, and with even some of the institutional investors saying, we don't actually need that information. So just focusing on those three, I don't know, Karen, Alvin, Marion, if any of you have a perspective on those three potential changes.
Sure, I'll jump in. I guess on the scope 3, I'll just add to the list of concerns that Melissa outlined is kind of political pressures on scope 3, right? So there is a lot of pushback, not just from public companies and other immediate stakeholders, but there's a lot of political pressure, I think, on scope 3, on the proposal overall. But I think scope 3 is right in the crosshairs there, and so it'll be interesting to see how the commission, thank you, and the chair respond to to the political pressure on scope 3. Yeah, the financial statement disclosure for sure. I think there's a lot of work to do if that rule is, if those provisions are adopted as proposed. I think a lot of companies have done some preliminary work to sort of evaluate where's the gap, looking at your existing processes and thinking about what you would have to do to sort of bridge that gap and get to the place where you would need to be for compliance with the rule as proposed. And there would be a lot of work to do, and I think that sort of influences the concerns about the effective date of the new rules and how long would companies have to really set up those processes. And I think, to me, that will be a really important component of the final rule proposal, or at least something I'll be looking for, is what is the effective date of the new rules. I wouldn't be surprised, and maybe this is hopeful thinking, but I wouldn't be surprised to see the SEC have a little more of a phase-in schedule for different aspects of the rule. The risk and governance disclosure, maybe that comes first, but giving companies a little more time to set up their internal processes in order to comply with whatever the financial reporting requirement turns out to be, as well as the Scope 3 disclosures.
And I can take here, I'll underscore your comments. Many of us were in wait-and-see mode in terms of watching the SEC proposed climate rule, and what kind of framework or standard would be applied. And so when TCFD, we read through the proposed rule and we saw TCFD, for people like me who already voluntarily disclose that kind of information, and companies who do so, it was very helpful. It also caused us not to be necessarily too overwhelmed, right? Because we've already put into practice some of the areas that the SEC aligned to. So I just wanted to underscore that was helpful. For us at Uber, as you know, Scope 3 would be very important to us, and that's pretty much the lion's share of our disclosures. When you think about Scopes 1, 2, and 3, it consumes 99%. So we are thinking through, and we did provide a comment letter to the SEC on the topic. Regarding the financial implications and component to it, it's something that we're thinking through constantly. We've got internal teams that are proactively running scenario analysis and doing everything we can to bring ourselves closer to the regulatory expectations that are forthcoming. So I think that would be our perspective from Uber.
Yeah, I'm wearing my investor hat on this. So I've worked in ESG for about 19 years, and about half of those years have been at issuers, and then half at investors and advisors. And right now I'm at an investor that's all active, all ESG, all long. And we wrote a comment letter on the climate proposal calling for mandatory Scope 1 and 2 emissions disclosure, which I just call clean silverware. Like everybody you really ought to be doing that. We also called for mandatory Scope 3 emissions reporting with reasonable safe harbor and exception for small reporting companies. To me, disclosing Scope 3 emissions should not be conditioned on individual company materiality, because this is a global, systemic, undiversifiable issue for investors. This affects at the portfolio level in addition to the company level and to the financial system level. So this is information that we need to be able to understand the vulnerabilities and strengths of the entire system. And the rules now is building on what was a good, solid foundation in 2010 when the guidance came out in 2010, but we didn't get enough. We didn't get enough information. And so right now, if you think your Scope 3 emissions isn't being used in decision making, you're wrong. It is, even if you don't report it. Someone's out there estimating it. So as a lawyer, you may be thinking, oh, this introduces too much risk because the quantification or the estimation or the tools. But you should know that decisions are being made about your estimated Scope 3 emissions anyway. So from a business perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and put that data out there.
That's great. I am going to make us transition, if that's okay, Melissa, because I realize we have a lot to cover. So let's just spend, if you don't mind, a couple minutes talking about the EU reporting rules, and particularly, for the companies in here that have some operations in Europe, what are the things they should be thinking about from a climate reporting and disclosure perspective?
That's great. I guess this might.
There we go.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, just kind of piggybacking off of what others have said, you have a significant amount of alignment in terms of TCFD aligned disclosures and requirements now that are going to be coming out of the EU. You have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is a successor to the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. Why this matters to all of you here is that the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, is a successor with, I would say, teeth in terms of extraterritorial reach. Previously, the NFRD applied to kind of EU-listed companies, EU operation companies, etc. The CSRD will also extend in terms of requirements, mandatory sustainability requirements, to listed and non-listed public and private non-EU companies. So that means US companies that have certain thresholds of touch points in terms of business in the EU. At this moment, you have a scaled or phased-in approach as far as applicability of the CSRD. So, as of January of next year, you'll have all of the companies that are currently reporting pursuant to the NFRD having to report pursuant to the CSRD. As of 2025, you have these large companies that meet certain requirements that will now become subject to the CSRD. And those large companies and the requirements could be meeting two of the three kind of conditions. One is like a balance sheet of 20 million euro or a net turnover of 40 million euro and 250 plus employees. So if you have a subsidiary or an affiliate that is in the EU and it touches on any of those items, then the CSRD will be applicable to that entity as of 2025. The more direct application is with respect to non-EU parent companies. There's a specific provision in the CSRD directive, which, by the way, was adopted last year, so it's now in force in terms of an EU directive. That particular provision, I think it's Article 40, will apply to non-EU parent companies as of 2028 if you have a subsidiary or a branch and have over 150 million euro turnover. And what that means from a reporting standpoint is that you would, as the non-EU parent company, have to either, at this stage it's not yet determined how you'd report, but you might have to report pursuant to the CSRD, meaning incorporating all of the European sustainability reporting standards, which we're going to get into, or you might be able to apply your own host country requirements and use that as the method that you report against, provided it's deemed as substantially equivalent by the EU.
Can I pause on
Yeah.
that? Just two things as takeaways. This is probably the second takeaway from today. First one is you should be doing something around climate regardless of your size. The second one is even if you don't care about this topic from a regulatory perspective, if you've got operations in Europe, you're going to have to care. It's going to become a reporting obligation. And I would just draw people's attention to the far right column, which Melissa just described. Again, two major criterion: large undertakings, 40 million in net turnover, that's revenue, 20 million in balance sheet, or in 2028, non-European, non-EU based companies with subsidiaries there with more than 150 million in revenues are going to have to be subject to it. And it's just important to say that and underscore it. You should be preparing. Sorry, continue.
I think one of the big takeaways for me is get your data off of Eric's desktop or Cindy's desktop. If your data is not already high quality, this should be the flicking lighter under your feet that says it's time for you to make sure that your data is high enough quality to report out. And especially if you're going to be subject to reporting in 2024, that means it started January 1st is the year that you should, if anybody needs to leave right now and go get your climate reporting.
Right. And the other reason why it's going to be, particularly relevant to all of you in this room is that it's not just climate, right? So the ESRS, which are the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, if you think the climate rule proposal is a lot, this covers both environmental and social and governance sustainability reporting metrics. As you see on the screen, there are subcategories within each of E, S, and G, and they have specific sustainability reporting standards. I think there's something like 84 separate sustainability reporting standards across those 3 categories, and something like over 1,000 separate disclosure and data points that are affiliated with those. Okay, and so when you're looking at environment alone, which is what we're going to focus on, the one that is the most analogous to the climate rule proposal is the ESR E1. But then you also have reporting standards that address pollution, so how a company is literally dealing with the pollution of air, water, and soil, and its transition plans to prevent and control and eliminate pollution. You have standards that are specific to water and marine resources, so marine biodiversity, and the plans and the items that the particular company is doing with respect to those. Biodiversity and ecosystems, and then the circular economy. So I'm not going to get into all of those, but that's just a lot. And then you have workforce and all of these other things under the social item. But basically that is, yeah, I think they got mixed up there, but anyways, yes. So in any event, lots to focus on, lots to think about in terms of that CSRD, the successor with teeth, extraterritorial teeth, that folks will need to, as Marion also said, start thinking about who has what information and how will you get to it. So I've gone through those already, and so I think we can probably, just given the time, move forward.
You don't want to keep talking about European ESG. I'm just kidding, guys. Okay, so now we are going to transition to more acronyms, but these are really important ones: TCFD, CDP. I think, Mary, you're going to take the lead on this.
Yep. I mean, we've heard TCFD acronym a bunch of times. You've probably heard it a lot before now, and I'm going to be talking about this mainly from my perspective as an investor, so the consumer of the data that you prepare, but really informed by also being a data preparer and then someone who advises institutional investors on it as well. So as an investor, what I want to know is, what are our portfolio companies doing about climate change? And you know, we called for Scope 1, 2, and TCFD reporting was another thing in our letter that we called for, mandatory TCFD reporting. So we want to know not just emissions, so our company's impact on emissions, so their impact on climate change, but the impact of climate change on the company and how these companies are planning for and preparing for a transition to a low carbon economy and the direct impacts of climate change. So usually when I go and talk about climate change in a room full of folks, I always, before I Google to try to make it more relatable to the major climactic disasters that have happened in that area in the last year or two. But unfortunately, San Diego seems to have the most temperate weather of any place in the entire world. So I'll have to fall back on my generic example, which is 143 degrees was a temperature last spring in India. And I'm cheating a little bit because it was a record, but it was also a land surface temperature. So it wasn't an air temperature, but just imagine your puppy's paws on 143 degrees. And imagine, when you're thinking about the impact that climate change has on your business, imagine what your business looks like in 143 degree weather. Like, how does that affect workforce availability? How does that affect your supply chain? There were tires melting on the tarmac in Heathrow last summer. Like, that's something that matters to your supply chain. It matters to your workforce availability. There's a city outside Scottsdale is one of the big headlines now that literally doesn't have water. So, I mean, these are the direct physical impacts. And as an investor, I want to know, what are you doing about this? What are your strengths? What are your vulnerabilities? Check out your insurability, too. I mean, insurability, reinsurance. I'm 42 years old now. I talk about reinsurance, not just insurance, but reinsurance, and how you're planning and thinking about your ability to continue to insure your operations. So TCFD, what is it? To answer the question, it's a framework that came out in 2017 on marching orders from the Financial Stability Board, on marching orders from the G20, to shore up our financial system and promote better decision-making by investors and companies when it comes to climate change. The best thing about it to me is it's just a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking, it's easy to understand, it asks 4 questions: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. Those are 4. They're clumped together, but that's 4. And then they ask 11 sub-questions under those that are really easy. So under governance, like how are you thinking about who's making decisions about climate change and with what information at the board level? As an investor, the board oversight of climate change, I cannot overstate the importance of it. Those are the people in the room representing me. Those are the people that we elect to watch out for our interests. So once you have board oversight of climate change, I can relax a lot more, because I know that our people are in the room there and that they're actually looking at the company at a strategic level, at the highest level, and also helping to provide the right incentives for management to pursue opportunities and reduce risks. Over 120 governments are supporting TCFD. It's required in a bunch of places already, and about 60% of the world's largest public companies already report to it. So we know that it's already catching on. It's actually, you can see even in the 2010 guidance from the SEC, the roots of this, thinking about it from a physical risk. So I'm going to take a moment just to talk about physical risk, which we already talked 143, which of course you remember. And I'll give you an example of one of the companies in our portfolio this year built a bunch of homes, a home builder, and they built a bunch of homes down in the in Louisiana, in southern Louisiana. They're mostly garbage now because they couldn't withstand the heat and humidity. Now, whether that's climate change, I don't know. Like, how can you ever point to one specific thing, to the 1% rule? Like, how sometimes do you even know if it's climate change or just extreme weather? But what I don't want is to have an entire portfolio of companies that are having to raise properties or, cancel services and operations because they haven't actually thought about what the future looks like. And you can think about droughts, floods, even migration, right? And physical risks to the health of your employees. Like, we have fires in California, and people don't come into the office, or they have asthma issues, they're going to the doctor, they're dying younger. Like, these are all things that we have to think about as direct physical risks of climate change and the impact to your company. The next is transition risk, which arguably is probably the more impactful, especially in a very, very near term to most companies, which is policy risk, legal risk, technology risk, and market risk, which is just changes to consumer demand or your supply chain ability. And there's some examples on that. On Uber, where I used to work, in some cities, there'll be a circle, and they'll say, okay, every car in this circle has to be electric, and no private cars. Commercial cars only, and they all have to be electric by tomorrow. Well, you better be prepared for it, right? I mean, of course, there's phase-in periods, but that's an example of a regulation that you need to prepare for. And it's worth a reminder that when you're talking about your climate change strategy, and you're like, oh, we don't have one, like that's not something we think about. You do have a strategy, right? Whether it's intentional or not, even if you've never articulated it, even if you've never written it down, you have a strategy. It's just a set of decisions, right? It's a set of decisions, and you have a strategy even if you've never even thought about it intentionally one time. So this is an opportunity to actually think about what your climate change strategy is. Like, maybe it's wait and see. Maybe it's the right thing to do nothing. It's just wait and see. That's your strategy. Or maybe it's reduce risk or retool for the future. But every company should think, I have a strategy. Is it the right one? And now is a very appropriate time with all the rulemaking that's coming along to actually take a look and see what it is. So we use the data, governance data, who's making decisions with what information. Get your board on board. Ugh. Remind me never to say that again. And any compensation links that you have to drive change in compensation. Look at long-term market information, macroeconomic trends. Be a history professor, be a futurologist. Like, I want you to sit there with the right people in the room to look at these informations and emissions. Your emissions reporting, emissions reductions. We want good businesses. Do you know what kind of business has zero emissions? Closed business. We don't want that. We don't want you to have no emissions. Like, we want you to think about the strategy what's the correct level of emissions? What kind of offsets do you need? How do you need to survive in this world? Like, we're all on the same team. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Finally, I was going to tell you how we look at emissions data. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but we apply a carbon tax to our investment. So we require additional returns for our highest emitters in our funds. And we also engage companies that don't report to CDP, and we're highly encouraging companies to get science-based emissions targets. And at some point, 50% of the world's asset under management are committed to net zero. Now, I'm going to say that 50% of the world's assets under management are committed to strive to aim for net zero, because I know that lawyers actually wrote that sentence, and they're committed to aim to strive to commit to net zero. But that's what NZAMI is it has about half of the assets in the world are saying, yeah, we're here for this, 2050, and there's a whole list of stuff you have to do. So just keep in mind when you're looking at your list of investors, we might be on there, Parnassus, like, you got to get there anyway, so now's a good time to do it. But importantly, TCFD is not a tool. It's not like you go in and log in, right? You don't log in, there's not a portal, there's no stupid radio buttons that you have to press. It's just a way of thinking. But what is that radio button is CDP.
Can I jump
Yeah.
in before you go to CDP? So I think my mic's working. So TCFD. Before I worked with Marion, not that familiar with TCFD. She came in like, we need to do a TCFD materiality analysis. And I have to say, I am now an absolutely convicted proponent of doing a TCFD analysis for every company. And here's why. When you heard Marion thinking about physical and transition risk and strategy and governance, and all, it sounds like a lot. But I think from my vantage point, it's actually been incredibly helpful for us in tailoring and structuring our overall ESG program, because part of the exercise is really thinking about what are the potential material impacts of physical impacts of climate change and transition risk on our business. And for us, it was an exercise that really no one at the company had ever done before. And when we came out of it, it really helped us. For one, it told us, honestly, physical impacts are not a big risk for us right now. And I actually think we have the same conclusion at Uber. I'm pretty sure that was where we concluded. And we did it based on data. We actually looked at our actual data at our company. There were some estimates that came out of it, but it was very helpful in structuring our ESG and climate program, because we can say it's not something we need to invest hundreds of millions of dollars behind right now. Same thing with transition risk. We looked at it and thought about it. And interestingly for us, and again, same for Uber, the transition risk was a much bigger and more immediate risk for us because we had a number of rules and regulations that we're subject to. Now commercially, I just gave a presentation to our management team. We get 500 RFPs a year that require information around our climate strategy and our climate plan. We have millions of dollars at risk to the extent that we don't have that information. And that fed into us deciding what kind of resourcing do we need for our overall ESG and climate program, what kind of board level oversight, what kind of reporting made sense for us. But the best part of it was I got to have a conversation with Marion and other of my investors and say, we did the analysis, we did the materiality analysis, we did a TCFD analysis. Here's where we came out as an organization, and here's how we're structuring our program based on that. And I think, I don't want to speak for you, but I do think for an investor, hearing that a company has done their work, right? You've done the homework. I think it's a comforting thing, and it makes me feel better about our disclosures and governance. So I just want to give a shout out there, and I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think another critical aspect of what you just said and what Marion just said is the fact that it's underlying the TCFD analysis and materiality analysis and alignment in terms of your reporting against TCFD is what investors, asset managers that have your companies in their portfolios, they're looking for this. And all of them are looking for this, not just in terms of, a viable investment for the long term, but now you also have an additional layer in terms of regulatory frameworks. The ESG climate-related rule proposal that's on the Investment Company and Investment Advisor Act side out of the SEC is looking to see how a company that states that it has certain ESG-related, i.e. climate goals, how can it actually put its money where its mouth is? And a lot of that will be based on what and how it would align in terms of its emissions and emissions calculations with kind of a TCFD type of analysis. And then you have the SFDR, which is a Sustainability Financial Reporting Directive, or maybe I don't have that right, but the SFDR in the EU, which is the equivalent, which also looks again to see how the portfolio companies, how can the asset manager look at portfolio companies and the information that they are providing pursuant to a TCFD aligned, GHG protocol aligned, science-based targets initiative aligned reporting framework. How can they use that information to both have accurate information about their investment, and from an investor protection standpoint, how can regulators be assured that investors, institutional and smaller investors, are actually getting accurate information?
I'll just add to that on the point of investor engagement, and I think having the CDP report and sort of going through that exercise of responding to the questionnaire can really help, especially for companies who are newer in their ESG reporting experience, can really help
start that conversation with your investors and answer a lot of questions from your investors as well. So I think to me, it seems like table stakes, although I'm aware of many companies now sort of moving away from CDP reporting and focusing just on their company-produced TCFD reports, and that's certainly another way to go. But I think, kind of comes back to this central point of investor interest in this kind of information.
And I'll just echo what you all have shared, that I think if you zoom out, you look at your company values and the people that you're bringing on board, you've got to get the right people who care about these issues, who are passionate about these topics. At Uber, I'm grateful, indebted to the foundation that Kier, you and Marion laid, and so many others. But we have a really strong, passionate sustainability group, an ESG team that works across the world. Right now, they're up thinking of strategies on how we can further expand on what we've done. So when you all started TCFD, then we're able to build upon that foundation. And last year, we expanded our reporting to cover Scope 3. Then we placed that disclosure into our ESG report. And for me, in staying, I would say, treating shareholders with a white glove touch and staying very close to them on these topics and sharing with them your strategy, it really helps to refine your approach as well, right? Throughout the year, we sit down with our shareholders in the off season and we say, hey, this is the direction we're headed, and we welcome that kind of feedback. But many of what, the different topics that we're describing today are a real opportunity for us to be transparent so that investors have what they need to make informed decisions.
All right, so it's 11:17, and I am worried that we're not going to have enough time for climate reporting. So, Marion, can you spend maybe 3 minutes maximum on
definitely.
CDP reporting? I know it's a simple
problem,
topic,
no problem.
and then we'll transition directly to collecting climate data and end on that.
I got it. Yep. Cheer gave me the figurative cane around the neck with a note. So CDP actually is a login. You log in, you type in your answers. There's a bunch of radio buttons. There's a lot of things with asterisks that you have to fill out. Information from there is extracted and used by raters and rankers. They're going to ask for your emissions. They're going to ask the same TCFD questions about governance, very specific questions, and you can log in and look at them yourself. But what's important is that information from there is extracted and used in other places. So I do think it's an important tool for communicating. TCFD, on the other hand, is for thinking. So I was told to give some tips on TCFD and CDP reporting. I'll just keep it to the top. TCFD reporting, don't do it for the reporting. It's the process that's important. Bring your senior leaders in early, bring in communications, bring in strategy, bring in lawyers. In fact, the lawyers should run it. You should have legal run it, don't record it. You should front load the planning, be judicious with your time, but don't feel guilty about the amount of time you're taking from senior leaders. This isn't something you have to do a lot of times. You just have to do it one time well. And I think you should take an approach that's like, do it and let the English see you do it, which means do this work and then keep a portion of it that you're able to share externally. Because some parts of it you'll want to keep just for internal decision making, but make sure that you're able to get credit for that from your investors. On the CDP, I highly recommend meeting with them before you do this, because I had a thing where we had 0 emissions for a bunch of subsidiaries, and I got no credit for it, and they dinged the score us down to a D because instead of putting zeros, I just left them blank. So there's a lot of hanging chad issues, and you may find you should focus your attention on sections A through F instead of G through H, depending on what your strategy is, because otherwise you're going to end up not having a fair score that people will be making decisions off of. So hire a consultant maybe to help you with it, and at least talk to CDP about, how do you score this thing? It's like one of those standardized tests from college where they're like, tell me exactly how you're going to score this.
So, yeah, let's keep going on this one, because I think it's actually,
I think it's also good to understand, your strategic approach when you respond to these different types of outlets. And so for CDP, I think there's this perception that it's all about you get the best grade if you provide all of this disclosure. So if I provide more disclosure and more, but you actually have to be very strategic in understanding how they also think about it as well, right? So if you have an F and you're reporting from CDP, that means you're non-responsive, or you received a request from a shareholder that was insufficient. If you get a D, right, the level of your responses are they're not complete, right? Then, in order to transition from a D to a C, you have to get at least 80% to transition. And when you get to that C, now CDP is letting you know, letting the company know, we appreciate that you've rounded out your disclosures to provide that level of completeness. And now when we get to this important distinction to if you get letter grade B or A, you've now provided the level of complete disclosure, but now you're also, it's about ambition and performance. So now they're able to ascertain from your disclosures how you're performing on the different, from a letter perspective. So I think, and I'm also a huge fan, I will absolutely back Marion up on that. Call me old school. I love picking up the phone, talking to people directly, and understanding, okay, how did we get this wrong or how do we need to get this right? And that's just not with CDP, that's with other organizations, Sustainalytics, the others, ISS, ESG. I think you also have an opportunity to learn from them, their perspectives. They do help inform your internal teams on assessing any gaps where appropriate, but I know I'm kind of deviating, but just wanted to share those quick thoughts about CDP.
Karen, did you
Yeah,
want to?
just a quick addition to that. I mean, I think the engagement is super helpful, but there's also, before you even get to that, there's tons of guidance that CDP puts out. They have guidance on how they score all the different questions on the questionnaire, and they have guidance on what the questions mean. And I think it's absolutely worth spending time with the guidance. Don't just read the question and I know what that means. You really gotta dig in, and it's just a way of putting your best foot forward, I think, on the questionnaire. So it's understand the question first and then develop your response.
So I'm totally violating my own rule because I'm going to add on this one too for a second. But I just have to say on the CDP thing, I agree with everything that's been said, and I want to underscore, the idea of phoning a friend, because on CDP, I think more than any of these other standard setters, there's a lot of detail, a lot of devil in the detail. First thing on the grade. So we at Broadridge just moved from a C to a B. Normally, most people are like, a B is not good enough, right? I'm an A student, I want to get an A. We are thrilled to get an A to get a B because it is so much work moving from a C to a B. I think C means you're aware, I think B means you're managing, whatever that means. And in order to get from a C to a B, we did increase the amount of information that we were including, but most importantly, we phoned a friend. And I hate shilling for any third-party group advising on this, but I will say it made a big difference for us. Having someone who actually had filled out this form for many, many other clients, they could say, you don't have to fill this one in. It actually will hurt you more if you put that information in, given what your response is. Leave this one blank, put a 0 here, et cetera. So I just strongly endorse it. And I'm looking at Mark Cronforce when I say this because we were on a panel. I was like, I hate accounting firms doing the ESG stuff. I changed my mind. They actually did help. So Mark, you were right. So I just encourage people to do that. The second thing on CDP reporting in general is that, as we've all kind of talked about, you don't have to do it. Not everyone has to do it. You really have to think about your own company, your own journey. If I had to make the call between CDP and TCFD, I would actually do TCFD every single time because it just helps you understand. It's like an assessment. Where are we as an organization? Whereas I find CDP to be a little bit more about that reporting out function. There wasn't as much information gathered in that process that was helpful to us. But anyway, I'll stop there. Melissa, were you going to join in before we move to?
No.
Okay. All right.
My last tip on that, which I actually wrote down, so I want to make sure I say it, is don't let a bozo fill it out. Make sure it goes through legal review. Make sure it goes through comms review. These are like free writing boxes, right? Like if you let someone go, if you're like, oh, no, I don't care about, we don't care about CDP, we're working on the business. Don't do it. Like make sure you look at it. Like have someone competent fill it out and then make sure you check their work.
And actually, I think there's a tendency to have a junior person in your organization filling out this information. That is a massive mistake. Honestly, we had a really, really smart, really, really super focused person doing it, but they did not have the experience with having completed it before. And when we brought in more people with expertise having done it, it made a world of difference for us.
I think he's talking about me when
No,
I forgot
never,
to fill
never.
in the zeros.
Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes left, and what I'd like to do actually is a little bit of an audible. I'm going to skip over choosing a reporting standard. We may come back to that in the course of the next topic, but I actually want to spend as much time as possible talking about the data collection process, because I do think certainly for me, if I was sitting in the audience, it's nice to hear about these things in theory. It's incredibly helpful to hear how people are actually doing this stuff. And I do think we'll hit on some of the standard questions along the way. That's okay with the panel. So Karen, I'm looking at you. I'm going a little bit earlier than we planned, but if you wouldn't mind kicking us off talking about the climate collection, data collection process.
Yeah, and I think, all of the points that were just made about CDP and TCFD reporting, including have smart people with a vision across the firm to do this stuff for you, I think that applies really broadly for climate data. And just to be clear, when I'm talking about climate data, I think the main thing we're talking about is the emissions data, but there's different components to that and different data points that go into calculating your emissions, and all of these considerations would apply to that. Certainly, companies have been doing voluntary reporting using climate data for a long time now. Different companies at different levels, so there's variation. I think variation in practice has developed that's been probably very company specific and to a certain extent industry specific. It's really essential to have good quality data, and I think more and more so as there is increasing focus on the data that you're reporting out voluntarily. The SEC is focused on it and sort of thinking about, well, why didn't you put that in your SEC filings? And your stakeholders are obviously very focused on it as well. So really trying to understand where your data is coming from and how you are ensuring the quality of that data is an important exercise for companies to go through. I think when the SEC proposal came out in March of last year, a lot of companies did to some extent go through this exercise of evaluating, well, gee, what data do we have? How hard is it going to be for us to gather scope 1, 2, and 3 data? I mean, some companies already knew the answer to that question, but a lot of companies didn't, I think. And particularly with respect to scope 3, I think there were a lot of questions, and so companies started to evaluate, what we have to do here. And I think that's a great exercise to go through. I think it'll pay off when the SEC adopts final rules, and I think it certainly applies to your voluntary reporting as well. There definitely are lots of software tools out there that can help you with streamlining your reporting and optimizing and creating dashboards and doing all this great stuff with your data. But ultimately, those tools are only as good as the data that goes into the tools. And so you're left, at some point you're left with having to identify what are the sources of your data and how are you going to have good quality data. I think there are a number of steps that companies can and probably should be taking with respect to their data collection. And I think at the very outset, companies need to just take a breath and assess what data do we want to report. To the extent where it's not mandatory reporting is not affecting this, what do you want to tell? What is your ESG story? What is your strategy with respect to climate? And how does data help you tell that story? And so really identifying what data you want to report. And then beyond what do you want to report, sort of what are the nuts and bolts of defining those boundaries or those categories of data. And there is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which we've talked about already, helps you to establish, what are your organizational boundaries, what type of data across your company is going to be subject to greenhouse gas reporting. And also operational boundaries, which help you decide, is this a scope 1 or is it a scope 3, or maybe it's scope 2. And so I think it may sound straightforward when you hear the definitions, but as companies get into really trying to identify their data sources, it's important to understand those distinctions and figure out what applies to you. There are plenty of third-party consultants that can help you do that, and that may be right for your company and it may not. I mean, my advice would be, if I were giving legal advice, it would be decide what you have, what expertise you have in-house first, right? What sort of capacity do you have, both in terms of technical expertise and bandwidth, frankly? And where you may be lacking in technical expertise, what's the solution that's right for your company? Do you bring it? Do you hire somebody with what you hope is the right expertise? Do you work with a consultant and just completely outsource that? My guess is it's going to be some combination of those things, but I think really understanding what your I know we have this sort of as a separate item on this bullet point list, but I'll jump ahead to controls and procedures because it is such an important aspect of the data collection and reporting process. And one thing I think that companies have started to understand as they think about the SEC's proposal is, gee, we need to make sure that we have good controls. I suspect that there are some companies doing voluntary reporting that maybe don't have the best controls over the quality or the accuracy and verifiability of their data. And so now would be a great time to look at that and make some improvements to those processes if you need to. You definitely need to have a clear process for how you're going to collect and track and measure and retain the data. The process, of course, has to be sustainable and repeatable, so you need to be able to do the same thing year after year. And you need to look at how your calculations are done. How do you get from gathering the activity data to turning that into emissions data? How do you do those calculations? And can you be transparent about it? And what is your process for verifying that those calculations are done correctly? If you are relying on a third party to do those calculations for you, then I think that gets factored into your controls as well, making sure that you understand what the third party is doing and that you have the appropriate due diligence process in place to confirm that. I think just document everything. You are likely to get asked questions about your data, and you want to make sure that you have great record keeping in place to support what you're reporting out. As well as, I think, what is driving your strategy, how you're measuring your progress toward goals, all of those things that you need the data to do. And then I think engaging your internal audit team can be very helpful. Once you've decided, here's kind of what we think our controls and procedures should be, bring in your internal audit team to pressure test those controls for you, see how they're doing and how successful you'll be. And then third-party assurance is also a big consideration here, I think. I was looking at one survey of corporate executives, and 96% of them said that they plan to seek external assurance in the next reporting cycle, with approximately 35% of those seeking external assurance for the first time. So a lot of companies are doing this. I think there are a lot of reasons that it's very appealing. It gives you more confidence in your data that you're reporting out. But I think as a first step, you have to make sure that your data is assurance ready, right? Before you raise your hand and say, assurance provider, please come look at my data, you want to have gone through this process already, maybe done some assurance testing to see if you are ready for that next step. Yeah, and I can pause there.
Well, I wasn't going to jump in with a comment, but I think, Alvin, you may have some thoughts.
Oh, sure, yes. I would say that for us, to one of your last points, the internal audit piece is really key. I can't tell you enough how closely I work with internal audit on internal controls. And it's not just internal audit, okay? We understand like that broadly, but it's actually having teams within internal audit that you're working with. So, at Uber, we have an ESG fraud risk team, and we have an internal control team that focuses on forthcoming regs, and we have another team that focuses, and we all work together, with some form of cross collaboration to ensure that we're checking all of our blind spots and that the right appropriate governance is in place around what we are disclosing, and that it's done with the highest levels of priority. I want the ESG, my direction to the ESG fraud risk team is that they should have eyes all the way down to the employee responsible for the data, because you can run into issues at that level if you're not checking your blind spots appropriately. And secondly, we ensure that our board of directors has clear oversight over this particular function in addition to keeping our general counsel informed every step of the way. So out of that list, there are so many different elements that are important, but then since we voluntarily disclose, you want to make sure your house is in order, right? And then we do also on the assurance piece, that's also another, we have a third party assure our climate strategy and data and emissions. And then we have a methodology. I think what else is important to add here is that having a methodology behind data calculation, in addition to the internal audit controls and external verification controls, serves as recipes for good data reporting practices. And I think, lastly, the good governance is especially important, especially as you think through how did you make your way to that data endpoint, right? And so those are just some of the things that we think about at Uber, and the questions that we ask are, what are our shareholders asking for, right? How is our program managed internally? How engaged is our board? And how aligned to the overall mission of our organization are our climate goals. So those are some of the areas that we focus on, and I think, importantly, we want to make sure that you have the proper governance around these different topics.
I just want to add one other thing that just pick up on something that Alvin said is just, understanding who's responsible for different data sources of your emissions data. And I think, that's obviously going to be, or it may be, depending on your business, dispersed across the organization. And you want to make sure that you have responsibility and accountability very outlined and very much clear to the participants in the process, and likely have some kind of centralized function that brings all of that together to ensure some consistency across the board.
Melissa, you're going to ask something?
Yeah, no, and just kind of piggybacking off of what Karen and Alvin said, I think, with respect to both the internal controls, internal audit, it's also very, very important to see how all of that ties to your disclosure controls and procedures, because of the scrutiny that we have seen in recent months from regulators around what is being reported, specifically with respect to some of this data. And their concerns over kind of things like greenwashing, et cetera. And it's consistency that is really important. Consistency across multiple platforms, multiple avenues or pathways, as far as if you're disclosing your emissions data or your targets or your transition plans in your CSR report, how does that tie to what you may already be disclosing in your SEC reports? And that has been comments. Those have been comments that have, over the last few months, have been issued by the SEC in terms of, again, really trying to dig into not just a materiality assessment, but to kind of part the curtains and see and get an understanding of the process by which some of the assessments on what gets disclosed and whether there's consistency in that disclosure, what that process looks like.
And I think that speaks to Marion's earlier point that you want to have legal involved in your voluntary reporting. That's one good reason, right?
Yeah.
Because if you just have IR doing your voluntary reporting, or you just have communications doing it, then they may miss that sort of overlay of what's in your SEC filings and making sure that you're not, talking in your ESG report about how material your activities are, for example, if you're not also disclosing those in your SEC filings.
It's a great point, and you put me on the path to checking a couple boxes. I needed to check a box on who owns the process, and I think you said legal should at least have a substantial role, if not owning it. And I think, I know, Alvin, that's the case at Uber. Karen, is that also the case at Schwab?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then, Melissa, what are you seeing with your clients in terms of who tends to own that reporting aspect of ESG data?
It's oftentimes, as the same persons that they have identified, and with some level of outside external counsel guidance as well.
Of course, you got to give the shout out to outside counsel. Predictable. No, I'm sorry.
But yes, some type of, external guidance just to kind of kick the tires to make sure that those processes and things like, how is it being documented and what are the processes that are being stood up? and I'll just say this very briefly, do not use Chat GPT, for example, to write your disclosure reports, right? Like, don't do it. Don't be tempted to do it. And this ties to Marion's, right? You know, so I mean, again, it's about the process, visibility into the process, and then visibility into how good the product, the work product will be. And thinking through things like your overall liability, exposure, risk. It's useful to have all those various groups connected.
So wait a second, Melissa. So I have a little bit of a bone now, because your topic on this slide was using AI and machine learning, and you just said we can't use ChatGPT.
Well, no. I'm just saying you can't use it to write everything and not check, and not have like real people check things like, where is the data source? The data that the AI uses is only as good as the data that is being collected, right? So the source obviously there has to be some level of validity, verifiability, and, you know, confidence basically in what information is being fed into whatever machine learning.
Okay, so wait, time out. So if we can't use ChatGPT, what tools do you recommend? Like, how do companies use?
Mr. Gums.
Yes, well, you know, machine learning and AI, I think it's a genuine question.
Garbage
like,
in, garbage out.
Yeah, like how do people use
Right.
machine learning to leverage the
So,
people involved?
I mean, and not so much the people, but maybe to save on resources or to be more efficient in terms of the resources that are being deployed in collecting some of this data. There are a variety of AI tools out there, for example, that would facilitate scenario analysis. So you have like climate intelligence AI that can look at all these various data points, taking from, you know, government-produced weather maps and weather information to a variety of other sources. But the point is you have machine learning that has been stood up, that's being used. Some of them, I'm sure, are being used by some of your organizations, but that can be used to at least help the process of collecting the data. And, you know, and then again, it has to be subject to some level of, I believe, human eyes looking at things like how good was the data source, what are the best practices with respect to this particular type of software, you know, auditing it on that level.
Okay, with 3 minutes left, last audible. First thing is, we're supposed to talk about tools for reporting. You've mentioned one of them. What was the tool you just mentioned? The AI. You mentioned one that was like that has climate data. What was the name of that one again?
The climate intelligence one.
Climate
There is
intelligence,
like
okay.
Climate intelligence. There is an AI. I don't want to say the specific company, but
Fine,
there
that's fine.
are companies out there that basically produce AI tools that and I think we know of another one. I think you were going to talk about.
I was going to mention Persephone, which
right.
is another tool that helps people collect. And again,
Right.
this is not us advertising for any particular.
Right.
But I do think often it's hard to figure out what are the tools I should
Right.
be using. And so
Right.
anyway, so those are two of them. I don't know if there are any other ones.
There is another one. I know that there's a company in Europe that does it. It's called Servest, that uses climate intelligence data, Persephone. There are a variety of entities out there that are, you know, truly being very creative and innovative as far as trying to collect good quality data and then translating that in ways that are going to help the company with respect to its overall obligations from an audit perspective, from a reporting perspective, and hopefully from an accuracy perspective.
Great. Okay. Last flash question for the group, and then I'm going to give a commercial for lunch. Last question is to assure or not assure. I don't think we quite got to this exactly. I've heard everyone mention internal audit is a good resource, so that's the internal piece, but that's not providing external assurance. So maybe Marion, I think you have a view on this.
Definitely assure. Definitely. If you don't want night sweats and you don't want to self-medicate with too much drinking, and you're in charge of this data, like you want to assure it, it's not that expensive.
And it's in terms of requirements and regulatory frameworks, both under the CSRD, there is the contemplated limited assurance, so a level of audit-like assurance, limited assurance graduating to reasonable in their timeframes, as well as proposed, there is contemplated under the SEC's climate proposal, this kind of graduated movement from limited assurance to reasonable assurance, and the whole, you know, framework of having an attestation provider and the requirements in terms of disclosure about that attestation provider, all of that point to assurance.
And they won't forget Peru, you know?
Karen gets the last comment and then the lunch.
Yeah, I'll just be
commercial.
super quick. I think assurance is great if there's quality. I think the assurance business for climate reporting or climate data probably has some room for growth. I think there's room for growth in standards and having sort of a common standard for that. And I think that, you know, I'm not saying assurance is bad. I think assurance is great, but, you know, you've got to have good quality data going into that process, and I think you just have to be aware of what you're getting out of that process.
Perfect. All right, we are going to end there. First, I want to ask for a round of applause for the wonderful panelists that we've got. Thank you. Second, we are going to break for lunch. Please head over to the Crown Room. The afternoon sessions will start at 1. And before you leave, if you want specific suggestions, come to any of us afterwards. We're happy to talk about any of these topics. Thank you all very much. Thank you.